you don't know who I am, so I thought I'd rectify that and tell you all who I am. My name is George Alicio, and I'm the Dean of the Weinberg Memorial Library, and I am also now the Director of the Schemel Forum. So if anyone has questions about the Schemel Forum or the library or the university in general, feel free to seek me out after today or reach out to me, and I'm happy to answer your questions. So now on to the program. More than ever, the strength and resilience of our democratic values are being tested. In fact, it is now evident that the fundamental tenets that shaped our society and our shared democratic ideals appear truly vulnerable. What was once an unthinkable question is now among the most pressing concerns of our era. How can we breathe new life into the foundations that uphold our democracy? It's troubling to think we, as a society, took democracy for granted. This complacency, though only a part of the problem, is indicative of the broader challenges that have led us to our current crossroads. We are privileged today to have with us a renowned scholar who will shed light on this urgent matter, drawing from the insights of luminaries like Plato, Aristotle, John Dewey, Martin Luther King Jr. Professor Moody-Adams will explore the challenges our democracy faces and the potential pathways forward. As the Joseph L. Straus Professor of Political Philosophy and Legal Theory at Columbia University, Professor Moody-Adams brings a depth of knowledge and a passion for the subject that promises to enlighten and inspire. Please welcome Dr. Michele Moody-Adams to the podium. Oops.
So it's just left.
Or the space bar,
Oh,
whatever
okay,
works
excellent.
best for you.
Thank you, thank you. I'm just delighted to be here, and the sun even came out to celebrate our time together. Thank you so much for a lovely introduction, too. So, the end of the 20th century was a time of considerable optimism about the future of democracy, even though the opening slide doesn't show that. In the late 20th century work of political philosophers, particularly John Rawls, who was actually my advisor as a graduate student, Rawls argued that despite persistent disagreement about values, well-designed democracies could achieve a stable consensus on a conception of justice. And lots of people wrote about how that consensus might, in fact, be possible. Actually, in political science, especially comparative political science, theorists debated mechanisms for strengthening fledgling democracies, the new ones that were just emerging, against breakdown and against the threats of authoritarianism. And it was widely assumed that established or so-called consolidated democracies were immune to breakdown. America, Germany, Canada, etc., France. But things started to change as the 20th century unfolded. And by the second decade of the 21st century, there was a lot of concern about whether democracies could survive. And Robert Foa and Yascha Mounk, two political theorists, one of them is more of a kind interested in ideas, the other one's interested in empirical facts. But they came together to write this very provocative essay. It was published in the summer of 2016 in the Journal of Democracy called The Danger of Consolidation. And they identified three features of established democracies that seemed to suggest signs of dangerous disintegration. The first was declining trust in democratic institutions, practices, and leaders. The second was the declining commitment to democratic norms and values. And particularly pronounced in the article, they point out how this was especially, this second item here, especially pronounced among the younger generation, which of course is when it's really scary. And then thirdly, increasing exploitation of partisan disagreement, and this was all around the globe, for anti-democratic and even authoritarian purposes. And so this is the reality they were describing that looked very different from what people thought at the early 20th century, late 20th century. Then the question is, why did this happen? What explains these developments? And I'm going to discuss very briefly here three explanations that people have offered. The first one is that post-Cold War democracies were simply rejecting Enlightenment values and ideals. And I mean ideals that were articulated and then defended among other people by the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau and someone who was greatly influenced by Rousseau, Immanuel Kant. The values that people thought were in question included a robust commitment to social and political liberty, openness to egalitarian ideals, not always the same ones, but an openness to equality, a readiness to question unreflective nationalism, and a preference for technical expertise that would sometimes challenge traditional sources of cultural authority. And what makes this explanation seem a little problematic, however, is that challenges to democracy did not just emerge in the post-Cold War era in the 20th century. In fact, the historian Jill Lepore has a wonderful article in the 2020 issue of The New Yorker in the summer, in which she says democracy was greatly imperiled in the years leading up to World War II. And indeed, she says in the late 1930s, I'm quoting from her now, were a time when, quote, democracy nearly died all over the world and all at once, kind of prescient anticipation of a title of a very popular film. So there was a second attempt to explain this deconsolidation that appealed to Plato in the book Age of the Republic in particular, where Plato argues that democracies just tend to destroy themselves from within. And so he essentially asks us to consider the possibility of two developments. One of them, is there an insatiable desire for liberty in democracies? Plato thought there was, and he thought it was dangerous. Is there irrational commitment to equality, in this instance, with regard to how we select our leaders, equality rather than merit in choosing leaders? And he thought that the combination of these two things would lead in any democracy to political outcomes that would make citizens desire a strong man, a tyrant, he actually calls him in the Republic, for citizens to want to be saved from themselves. Now, it's important that even on Plato's view, you had to understand history to understand the specific forces that activate the destructive effects of liberty and equality in any given country. But Plato's pessimism, if you're convinced by it, what you believe is that it's democracy that endangers democratic citizens and not anything about particular values that they might be articulating. This would, for many, strike at the very core of your faith in democracy, if you have such faith, in part because one reason many people value democracy is because it seems to offer the possibility of combining a robust protection of individual liberty, or at least liberty in general, with a commitment possibly to substantive equality. So this makes many people want to resist Plato's challenge to democratic faith. And one of those people is John Dewey, who offers what is, I think, an important third explanation of why democracies fail. His explanation comes in several places, but particularly late in his career. I think he was actually already 80 when he was writing this. But he's writing it at that time that Jill Lepore says democracies were deconsolidating. And he said, look, the problem is not with the values themselves. The problem is not with democracy somehow intrinsically endangered by the values. It's our failure to ask enough of the institutions that are supposed to embody those values or realize those values, and our failure to ask enough of ourselves to protect them. So Dewey actually has a profoundly distinct answer, and I think a kind of ground for optimism about the possibility that you can save democracy. And in fact, for me, one of the most inspirational things I've ever read about comes in that 1939 essay. So, Dewey wrote a lot about democracy, but this to me is one of the most inspiring. He says, look, the task of democracy is forever that of creation of a freer and more humane experience in which all share and to which all contribute. And Dewey actually thought that the institutions and practices that are central to democracy could actually make life better, and that there are ways in which, if we thought properly about what democracy requires, that we could save ourselves from the decline of democracy. And as I read Dewey, and as I think about the scholars of the current era who have a very profoundly Deweyan optimism about democracy, there are three important tasks we need to undertake. And so I'm going to argue the first thing we need to do is develop what Dewey himself, actually in that same essay from 1939, called the habit of amicable cooperation. He knows we're going to disagree. Human life involves conflict and disagreement, but how do you do it in a way that doesn't destroy your shared life? Secondly, I'm going to argue, Dewey doesn't use this language, but I'm going to argue that it's important for us to strengthen trust generally amongst ourselves. But one of the most important dimensions of civic trust is the trust we have in our leaders and in the expert people who advise our leaders when they're making policy. I'll talk in the third section actually about horizontal trust, because trust generally is a civic virtue that democracy depends upon. So we'll talk about cultivating those. In addition to civic trust, I'll talk about the importance of civic sacrifice, which you don't hear people talk about much anymore, and the importance of something I've come to call civic grace, which is a readiness to extend to all of our fellow citizens what Martin Luther King once described as understanding goodwill. And it's a commitment to seek shared values that actually will further amicable cooperation. So here we'll turn to what this habit, involves. There we go. So what I'm going to argue is that if we start from what scholars of peace building and conflict studies have taught us, there are ways of structuring our response to conflict, even the most vigorous, vehement, dangerous, warlike conflict, that will allow us to salvage something called amicable cooperation. But we have to start first by understanding what conflict is. So it turns out to, as a background assumption, that even the most simple conflict, say a conflict in our public discourse about abortion, it's never just about one thing. Obviously, abortion is about the moral and legal status of the fetus, but it also involves disagreements about gender roles, about the meaning and value of individual autonomy, about the right balance between rights and responsibilities. We were talking about this earlier. And certainly about the authority of religious doctrine, right? So those are some of the disagreements. So you don't have a chance of getting amicable cooperation if you don't understand what it is you're being in conflict over. And Dewey thought that the important thing is to remember that democracy may be one mode of political life that gives us the best hope of this amicable cooperation. He says it's the belief that even when ends and needs and ends or consequences are different for each individual, the habit of amicable cooperation, this is where that phrase comes from, which may include, as in sport, rivalry and competition, is a priceless addition to life. And so you have to start, if you want to save your democracy, you've got to understand that's really what it's best at. And then you ask the question, how do we design our institutions? What norms and values should we accept to make this possible? And I'm going to argue that what we need to learn is that even when we identify a conflict, we have to ask, what are the kinds of solutions to which even the most vigorous and difficult conflict is susceptible? And it's going to turn out that it isn't only about somebody getting domination over another, or even about compromise. There's something called conflict transformation that's possible. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But then, in addition to understanding the possibilities of how to respond to conflict, which I'll talk more about in a moment, understanding how complicated most serious conflicts are, we've got to be clear on what it is to bring a conflict to an end. And sometimes people assume that the only way rationally to end a conflict is for everybody to agree on someone's solution. But it turns out there are times in which amicable cooperation can include reasonable agreements to disagree. So if you work in an office where some people have religious beliefs that require them to restrict their diet and not eat pork, and we know there's more than one religion that asks that of people, but they may work with some people who don't have that restriction, and if you give them one microwave, they're not going to get along terribly well. What do you do in such a situation? You have a company break room where you put two microwaves in. One that's used for people who don't eat pork, and you might not want them so close together as in this picture, but one that isn't. And it's very important to know that it's perfectly rational to be willing to say this. Now, of course, in political life, there are many conflicts that you can't resolve. You can't rather manage, is a better phrase, that this way, because sometimes they do require one solution for everybody to agree on. You know, if you have a disagreement about whether the US should have a debt ceiling or not, right, you've got to choose one position over the other. Either you have that policy or you don't. And that's actually called domination of one position over other competing views. But domination isn't the only option. Amicable cooperation, it turns out, also demands openness to political compromise. And here I'll give you some examples. I'm actually, in a moment, going to give you a quote from the Edmund Burke's speech from 1775 on conciliation, which talks unexpectedly in an engaging way about the importance of cooperation. Here's a book from the late 20th century by Amy Gutman, you know, the president of the University of Pennsylvania, and her colleague Dennis Thompson. And then this is a recent book. It's actually an anthology of, I think, very important discussions of compromise. It's from the early 21st century. It has an essay of mine on compromise, which I'll briefly refer to later. But it's important to note that people assume that compromise is somehow more associated with one end of the political spectrum than the other. But Edmund Burke was in fact a great founder and expositor, if you will, of conservatism, at least European 18th century conservatism. But here's what he says: all government, indeed every human benefit and enjoyment, and every prudent act is founded on compromise and barter. And I love this language. We balance inconveniences, we give and take, we remit some rights that we may enjoy others. And I love this line, and we choose rather to be happy citizens than subtle disputants. I think there's a lot of our political life today that would be better if people thought about it in this way. One challenge from my perspective as a theorist of some of these issues is that not just any kind of compromise is compatible with the best that democracy can offer, or even the best that democracy ought to ask of us. I've argued that democratically defensible compromises should have a certain characteristic. They should be principled. And here's what I take that to mean. The processes that produce it should be transparent. Shouldn't be a secret what you're trying to do when you're negotiating compromise. Any sacrifices it requires should be meant to minimize harm and promote mutual respect. And thirdly, it should encourage genuinely democratic cooperation. And so I argue this in an essay that I published in 2018, actually in that third volume that was on the other screen. Regrettably, some of the most important compromises that shape the history of modern democracy, if you will, didn't meet this standard. From my perspective, it's regrettable that some of those compromises in that category of not meeting this are compromises that preceded ratification of the Constitution, the electoral compromise, the great compromise that allowed small and large states to have the same number of senators, and perhaps especially the 3/5 compromise that denied the legal personhood and the moral status, humanity really, of enslaved persons. But compromise is out there at least as another option. Now, what's important is that if we step back and we take stock of all the options for ending conflict, so you move past, oh, we're going to agree to disagree, we want to end it, there's more than one way. One of the great, I'll call her kind of pragmatist-inspired public figures of the early 20th century, a woman named Mary Parker Follett, who in an essay from 1925, it's actually very famous. If you do any work in management studies, you would know her work. She moved into the corporate world, and in fact, negotiations between labor and the corporate world also. And she said, look, there's three options for ending a conflict. One is domination, so the debt ceiling, either you have it or you don't. One is compromise. Each side gives up a little, this is her language, in order to have peace, or in order that the activity which has been erupted may go on. Or integration, and this is the hard one, which she says is not so easy to accomplish in political life, where the desires of both parties find a place so neither side has to sacrifice anything. And this is, for her, the gold standard of conflict ending. The heart is won in some contexts. This is, she says, it's the only ending to conflict that actually really stabilizes your shared life. And it stabilizes, it's important, by creating something new. And I think, interestingly, I'll suggest very briefly in a moment that one of the great things about a lot that John Dewey wrote is that he's really focusing on how to reshape democratic institutions so they might make integration possible more often. But I have come to learn about the work. This is the one slide where I wish I could add some commas in. I think I accidentally took them out when I sent the file in. But there is a marvelous scholar of international peace building. He was at the University of Notre Dame until very recently. I think he just retired. And he also has been a distinguished scholar. He's a Mennonite by religious conviction at the Mennonite University. He's written extensively on conflict resolution and mediation. This is one of the books. And he's actually widely known for pioneering work in the field. He's done training programs and conflict transformation in like 25 countries around the globe. And he knows whereof he writes and speaks. And he says, what you need to do is stop talking about conflict resolution and talk about conflict transformation. That's where you get that something new that Mary Parker Follett talks about. And he says, look, if you want to understand the difference, resolution, I love his language here, implies finding a solution that guides our thinking towards bringing some set of events or issues, usually experienced as very painful, to an end. We seek you just want it to come to an end, right? We seek a conclusion. The guiding question is this: how do we end something that's not desired? He says that's very different from what you do when you're thinking about transforming a conflict. I love his language here. This directs us towards change, to how things move from one shape to a different one. The change process is fundamental to this guiding language. Transformation's guiding question is, how do we end something not desired, but build something we do desire? And I think he could even have added something shared that we desire. So I think this is a really important idea. Some of his writing also argues that this is the kind of project that lets us open the door in political life to reconciliation, even between formerly warring parties. And he's got the experience to prove it. It doesn't mean that it won't bubble up somewhere else, but he can show you how, with the right attitude, you can find ways of transforming even just very long, lingering conflicts in places where you thought people would never end a conflict through methods of transformation. And I should say one of those methods involves imagination. I'll talk at the end of my remarks today about the complicated ways in which you can introduce the products of imagination into this discussion. The problem is, in ordinary political life, what we need to happen isn't going to happen if we go to the people who are engaged in partisan electoral politics. We need forums in which citizens learn skills that encourage conflict transformation. Because you can see what's at stake in a really serious conflict. Somebody's gonna die, right? Somebody's gonna lose something really great. Someone's going to suffer or be sacrificed in some very great way, even when it's not about losing life. But the problem is our ordinary electoral politics, especially when it's about raising money and then tailoring your opinion during the money-raising goals to the most extreme versions of your view. That's not openness to conflict transformation. I've suggested, I'll say just very briefly here, that what we might do is go to non-governmental organizations, to including religious organizations and others, maybe the ones who have stayed out of electoral politics. And it's not always easy in this world to find that anymore. But I think they could help us construct forums. They would have to start at the local level, but then you would have to have a national network of forums to people to discuss the outcome of their forums. I think the three things I would say are critical. And in fact, it turns out, according to Jill Lepore in that article I mentioned from the New Yorker, people did versions of this in the late 1930s. Ordinary people. People say nobody has an appetite for this, but people do. They have to be in person. Right now, if you use social media, people won't take responsibility for what they say. You'd have to force people, I think, to confront their disagreements about history. Since I talked about disagreements being complicated, a lot of what divides us right now is divided views about what the history that matters really is. And then you would have to give people an opportunity to share what the sociologist Arlie Hochschild has called their deep stories that may tell you less about the world than they tell you about the people. But if people are telling deep stories in these forums, you sometimes have to call them back to asking about how their stories fit with historical truth. And that's going to make it hard, but I don't think it's impossible. So now I turn to section 2, strengthening vertical civic trust. Now, this is important because a great deal of the debate about what democracy requires, particularly in a modern, complicated, administratively complex setting, the question is, how do you make government that's supposed to be by the people actually work expertly and efficiently for the people, unless you give some of the responsibility for democratic deliberation and policymaking to experts? This idea is as old as Plato's Republic. Plato actually said the only people who should have political power are people who have objective knowledge of the nature of a life worth living. And he thought ordinary citizens were the people least likely to have that knowledge. So he had a powerful skepticism about the people and what they could be entrusted on. That skepticism continues in modern debates. One version of the debate began a century ago involving John Dewey and another very prominent public intellectual, journalist, and I call him a public philosopher, named Walter Lippmann, who in a very wonderful and still influential book actually argues that the best thing a self-governing people can do is to seek to transcend their casual experience and their prejudice. And this book, Public Opinion, is about all the prejudices we were subject to, by inventing, creating, and organizing a machinery of knowledge. And sometimes I'll emphasize that phrase, machinery of knowledge. He says what that means is we should just authorize all of our governing agencies to create bodies of research and information. He called them intelligence bureaus, who would just be operating on their own, not talking to you and me, and just generating this knowledge that would advise policymakers on our behalf. John Dewey was deeply troubled by this. He never denied that there are problems with our competency as democratic citizens, partly because the world is so complicated, because what it takes to understand a particular problem in the world, right, requires a lot of knowledge that maybe the ordinary person doesn't have, and also kind of skills, like certain mathematical skills, certain kinds of other reasoning. And you say, well, are ordinary, in quotes, citizens the right people? Dewey understood the source of this objection, but he said, look, so in one of my favorite books, The Public and Its Problems, he says, I don't deny, he writes, in effect, that experts can have sound recommendations in many instances, but can they if they're cordoned off from the public they're supposed to serve? The man who wears the shoe, says Dewey, knows best that it pinches and where it pinches, even if the expert shoemaker is the best judge of how the trouble is to be remedied. And think of him as saying, and a lot of this Public and Its Problems is organized really around acknowledging the Platonic skepticism and some of it's reasonable, but saying, look, in the end, you're not going to get good policy if you don't ask the guy with the shoe that's too tight, where does it hurt? And so he ends up, I think, putting to us the challenge of finding a way to get citizen input in a way that also would increase our trust in the experts that they were doing the right thing, that they were actually accountable to us. I'll add that in the spirit of Dewey, a contemporary philosopher, brilliant young, well, she's my age, maybe she's not so young, philosopher named Elizabeth Anderson. We actually went to school together, which is part of why I always say that. She says the problem is not just that the experts cut off from the people when they do their work, but that we educate them in ways that create a distance. She calls it epistemic distance, the distance of knowing what their lives are about. We create this distance from the very beginning. And she said, look, maybe we ought to be educating experts and elites more fully in settings where they're not so completely separate from the people they might later go on to serve. She says it creates all kinds of cognitive deficits, and that we need more constant personal contact across social divisions. I have to say, I think that's more important. I mean, East and West, North and South, so many divisions here that we end up kind of shaping early in people's experience. One other challenge that we have to confront that comes from the distancing is that we don't understand what it's like from the inside. It's one thing to have the guy wearing the shoes say, well, here's where it hurts. We don't understand what it's like if you have to get up and go to work and put on a pair of shoes that are hurting your foot, right? You've got calluses and whatever. No one asks, what's it like from the inside? One of the people best attuned to the importance of that question was the sadly now deceased Paul Farmer. I was teaching a class one day during the end of the pandemic, and one of my students, I was talking about Paul Farmer, and she was actually auditing, she's looking at her phone, and she said, he just died. And I thought, oh my gosh, it was a loss to the world. In this wonderful essay, I'm going to put both quotes out and then talk about them. Wonderful essay, which he gave, I think, as a speech a couple of different times. He would give it like at graduations and so forth. Accompaniment as policy. He says, look, what we need is a model of policy making that starts from an assumption about who matters and what matters that we don't always value. It's a concept that he got from the work he did in Haiti, the concept of an accompagnateur. And this is someone who he says it's about sticking with a task until it's deemed completed by the person or people being accompanied. So if you were trying to prescribe medication for someone who is suffering from some chronic illness, and you go to their home country and you learn now they come back to see you and they haven't been taking it. Why aren't they taking it? What is it about their daily life that's challenging them? You need to know what they confront as they go through their world, trying to figure out, are they taking their high blood pressure, anti-high blood pressure medicine? Why aren't they doing it? It's easy to be dismissive of this attitude of trying to understand from the inside in a world in which arcane expertise is advanced as the answer to every problem, but expertise alone will not solve the difficult problems. And I like to remind people that Farmer, so he had this NGO, Partners in Health, some of you may even have heard of it, they managed to get the country of Rwanda, post-genocide, to become the first sub-Saharan African country to meet all the health-related goals of the UN Millennium Development Initiative. That's extraordinary. They couldn't even talk to each other when he first arrived. And so he found ways of using accompaniment as policy. Now, there are a few other things that promote civic trust, and it's vertical. And this, I like to call these institutional virtues. Here's the problem. Think about the Flint water crisis. I won't go through the whole detailed issue here that went from 2014 to 2021. There is a long story there about how when the decisions that led to the use of the Flint River water, that then led to one of the most severe and deadly outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease in American history, and widespread lead poisoning that has damaged young minds that will have effects to this day. Part of the challenge was they basically didn't want the people of Flint to tell them what was going on in their lives. And some of them knew the Flint River was too dangerous, and that there was insufficient concern about how that would damage their water lines and water systems. They also weren't transparent about decisions. Nobody told until the decisions had been made by an emergency manager that we're just going to change the way your water is supplied to you. And they would discount citizen testimony. People would say, I turned my faucet on and this yellow gunk comes out. And they would say, oh, you're exaggerating. Until people would take pictures, and show that there was something going on. In addition to the intellectual virtues, there are epistemic virtues that are important for civic trust. So I'll put all of them out and talk briefly about each as we go. One of the things we need to ask of our experts, and Walter Lippmann never talked about this, is, are you telling me the truth about what you don't know? This was part of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Where people had no idea how COVID-19 was transmitted, and they were telling you what you should do before they fully understood it. Humility regarding past harms. I mean, there is all sorts of evidence that, I'll give you a very quick example. In 2021, January, the American Psychiatric Association acknowledged, to great fanfare, it was on their website, it was in national stories, that they had basically supported policies for more than 100 years that had marginalized, denied the mental health needs of misinterpreted, misrepresented communities of color for just extensive amounts of time in American psychiatry. They would misdiagnose depression and schizophrenia. That's actually still happening. So you've got to acknowledge past harms. And then, of course, this is linked to the idea of being accountable for your harms. And then trustworthiness, right? If you tell me that you've made mistakes and that you will try not to make them again, you put mechanisms in place to avoid it, I will become more likely to trust you. Now, I think it isn't enough just to have informal ways of showing you have these virtues in place. I think we need institutional structures that help us do two things. Help us get from our experts that they can tell us what counts as being accountable, and they can establish that they've been that way. It's all about telling the truth, it's showing your limitations, etc. But also we need to treat experts and citizens as partners in framing problems and devising solutions. And there are countries, France is one of them. This is the Bahamas, I think. There are countries all over the globe where they've already started using, and Canada, something called deliberative citizen assemblies, where people are given a certain amount of material to read. They're allowed to discuss it in a small group of just citizens, and then they bring the experts in and they discuss, they ask questions. And in some of these instances, policy making actually is the outcome of the discussion. And of course, no one says that they'll always be as good, these assemblies, at making policy as they ought to be, but people get better with practice, right? And that's something we've not allowed people to do. So I think my second solution is, structures that allow people to behave as partners, and they can trust the people they partner with, even though the partner might have some asymmetry with regard to knowledge. So finally, cultivating democratic civic virtues. I've talked about trust. I talked vertical trust. I said that I would also talk about civic trust. I'll talk about two more in a moment. One of the things that Dewey was best about is understanding that a democracy will not survive unless we change the way we act within it. We've got to believe, you saw that we have to believe that it's an individually valuable way of life, even though we're part of the kind of collective organizations. And also that we're willing to possess and shape and cultivate the kind of character that lets us do that. I think there are three civic virtues that are most critical to the stability of robust democracy. Civic sacrifice, which I'll talk about each in turn. Generalized civic trust, which for me is both vertical, and when I say horizontal, I mean the trust between citizens, and then that civic grace, which I said was this understanding goodwill towards fellow citizens. I'll say more as the points down. But sorry, you didn't see my civic grace. There you go. So civic sacrifice. And I have to tell you, I had the greatest time thinking about coming here. I'm so grateful for the invitation because my husband and I drive through Pennsylvania a lot. We sometimes on the way back, I drive to visit my mother in Chicago, and it's just more fun than getting on a plane and, your pajama party in the airport. I just prefer this. I love Pennsylvania. And I found this wonderful thing about sacrifice during World War II, which was, as some of the people in this room might know, my mother has talked to me lately about this, how serious the sacrifices were. But sacrifice is not just about civic sacrifice, about choices regarding war and combat. Everyday democratic life, if we do it right, demands continual and sometimes significant sacrifices. So here's the thing, right? If you know that someone who you believe has done something awful is subjected to the legal process, but they get off, right? I can give, my example would be O.J. Simpson. You've got to understand that the institutions that produce that bad result, sometimes we hope more often than not produce a good result. So you've got to swallow your disappointment and accept that you're not going to engage in individual vigilantism, even if you think one instance of the process didn't work well. We have to listen to people say things that we don't like if we value liberty, freedom of speech, and freedom of thought and so forth, and freedom of the press. Every day you're hearing something that is distressing to you. And then if you say to yourself, well, maybe it's more important that I protect the institutions that allow free speech than that I, silence this one person who could then silence me, that's a good thing, but you're making a sacrifice. And that sacrifice is so central to democratic life. We don't teach people the value of it anymore. People talk about the Great Generation. I think it really was a generation that understood the importance of sacrifice to the support and continuance of democracy. But then there's generalized civic trust. And I think there are three issues here. One of them is that we need to prevent extreme income inequality. I'm not talking about making everybody equal. I'm not even sure I know what that would mean. But the extreme inequality we've allowed, where the CEO is making outlandish amounts of money and the guy on the line building the car is not living terribly comfortably, that's problematic, right? Prevent widespread de jure and de facto segregation of subgroups. I'm not just talking about race, you'll see in a moment. I'm talking about class, as like the expert, non-expert educational. I'm talking about geography. And it turns out that if you don't limit cultural isolation and division focused on geography, you are never going to have generalized civic trust. There's a great scholar, a political scientist named Eric Oslaner, who taught for many years at the University of Maryland, who's written at length about urban and rural, north and south, east and west, the coast, right, and the heartland. If we don't break down that sense of division, we are never going to have peace and calm, I think, in our society. But here's something, before I get to the civic trust, this is one last important point. One of the things we have to do is address declines in horizontal trust, even in the places where you least expect it. I learned about this example during the pandemic. I was writing some of this stuff and trying to figure out what mattered. This is a town called Protection, Kansas. In its 2020 population count, it had 498 people. I read that it hasn't changed much over the year. My husband's from Kansas, not this town, but he says, yeah, there are a lot of little towns like that haven't changed much over the years. Scholars rarely ever ask what happens in towns like this when the world changes in the ways I described at the start of the talk. In April of 1957, the residents of this little town, all 400 and whatever of them, got together in the one high school gym to get their polio shots on something that was called Polio Protection Day. Now, it was organized by what is now known as the March of Dimes. It was then called the Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, but they bought into it, and they even had a parade to celebrate being the first town to be fully inoculated against polio. Here is a picture of the entire family of a man who's now about 71. His name is Douglas Hurd. You'll see the next slide I talk about him. They all lined up to get the shot, and then they marched in the parade, and very proudly, right? And here's what he said about this event. He says, it succeeded because town residents trusted each other to recognize the importance, and I'm quoting here, of everybody coming together to do something good. This is from an article in the, it's online NPR account, and I've seen it reproduced other places, but the guy McLean got the first story, and I think it's just an amazing thing that he did this. So think of that, right? Here's Mr. Hurd, 2021. He said in that same article, he said, I couldn't imagine coming together that way in 2021. He said, not a chance. It would be impossible because we'd all take sides. And you should know that he says in the article, and I'm not here to belittle or demean anybody's response. I'm just mentioning the response, right? He says there were people who believed the pandemic was not serious and that to get the vaccine would be to subject yourself to being injected with microchips so the government could track you. Now, these people genuinely believe this, but he said, look, that means you're not going to be able to get that kind of cooperation. And it's neither here nor there, in my view, that about the particular issue. It's the fact of the decline of horizontal trust. And I believe, so now coming to the what I hope is a resolution, I'll put both parts of it up. Okay, there, I was doing fine before, there we go, okay. Two aspects, I think, of civic grace, and there are people who've talked about something that one theorist called political grace. A philosopher of religion named Jeffrey Scar has used this language. I actually came to this notion of civic grace independently, but I thought I need to be giving credit to people who are talking about something similar, but it's not the same notion, because mine is elemental. His is about what you do in political conversation. Mine's just how you lead your life generally. We need to have, first of all, a readiness to relinquish resentment, bitterness, and demonizing other people, even when we lose out in a political contest. And I'll add, secondly, I won't say too much about this, but there's a political scientist named Jane Mansbridge who said, if you could do that, you could get people to accomplish all sorts of things, because even if you don't yet really think somebody isn't your enemy, but you're ready to relinquish bitterness towards them, you can at least negotiate. She actually teaches a course at Harvard where she says, I can show you that even in the midst of hostility, negotiation is a teachable skill. But obviously, if we want a robust shared civic life, that's not enough. People have to learn how to formulate shared political ideas and seek substantive goals. But I'm about to conclude now, I hope, with what will be an appealing idea. Civic grace, particularly when you got both components, can produce exemplary statesmanship. The great Irish poet Seamus Heaney calls Nelson Mandela the miraculum. Some of you may know I was talking about the famous Pennsylvanians. Joe Biden is a big fan of Seamus Heaney's Cure at Troy and the chorus, the hope in history rhyme. That was about Nelson Mandela. A lot of people don't know that. He gets released from prison in 1990, and he could have said, I'm just going to kill everybody. He said, I'm not going to kill anybody, and neither are you. We're going to find a peaceful way to reconcile and try to live our lives. Two instances of that, you can see he was co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize with F.W. de Klerk in '93. And my favorite example, he comes out on the field during the Rugby World Cup in '95. And this is just after he's elected the first president and certainly the first black political leader in South Africa. And everybody there said, this is a gesture of reconciliation. I think it's civic grace. Where else do we find civic grace? It can enrich the exercise of creative imagination. This is a hard example for some people, but I'm hoping the next slide will show you why it's a great example. She was 21 years old, well, she's not quite 21, senior in college. She enters this competition, 1,400 other applicants. She wins the design competition for the memorial. And you should know, it wasn't just the picture. She had a long sort of description that she'd written, and here is the design before it's realized. There's actually a satellite image, so you see the result really kind of mirrored the original vision. But what's wonderful is what she did with it. I'm going to put all three of these up. These three sentences at the bottom of the slide, we reproduce three of the four conditions that any winning entry would have to meet. The fourth one is, don't be political, but not clear if that one's easily done. But she harmonized with the surroundings. There are the two walls of polished black granite. She produced a reflective and contemplative site. That's my husband. Actually, I asked him, I said, is it okay if I use that slide? That's my finger, and that's my significant other. I'd gotten the name. Nobody in my family actually fought in Vietnam. It's unusual because I had a lot of people in the military, but I asked someone I worked with, actually when I was at Cornell, and his name there is on the screen. Produce a reflective and contemplative site, contain the names of all who died or remain missing. You know, there was a lot of controversy around the beginnings of it, but it's currently the most visited monument on the National Mall Memorial. 5 million people a year. It's done a whole lot of healing. Doesn't mean it solved the question of whether we should or shouldn't have been in Vietnam, but it allowed people who weren't even treated well because for fighting on behalf of the U.S. to reclaim their citizenship and feel like they were once again Americans. So here, I'm about to conclude. The third point I make then is that citizens of democracies must encourage their leaders and themselves to cultivate and appreciate civic grace. I don't think there is another person. I think more than Martin Luther King, I think more than many other people in the civil rights movement. This is a man who had his head bashed in a couple of times fighting for civil rights, and he never got violent. He never gave up. And some people may say, well, it isn't my cause, but it was a cause that many people believe made the world better, certainly America better, and he did it without bitterness and resentment. I think that's an amazing fact, that's evidence of civic grace. So democracy might have a future if we can lessen polarizing conflict, strengthen trust in democratic institutions, I should have said, and leaders, and if we can encourage civic grace as a path to civic trust and civic sacrifice. Thank you so much. We were in Greece together this summer. That was fun. Or should I take them?
We'll go all around.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
Yes, thank you. There's a lot to think about. You touched on it, but not very strongly. And I'm reminded of, I just looked up Brandeis's quote, that you can either have great concentrations of wealth, you can have democracy, you can't have both. And the role of money. And it seems that the oligarchy that has developed in our country in many ways, they're going around two different lines. One is the destruction of institutions, the Steve Bannon idea, which allows exploitation and just greater concentrations of wealth. And then you have the capture of institutions that Ruth Ben-Ghiat and Sheldon Whitehouse talk about. We've seen with Leonard Leo, with the Supreme Court, Harlan Crow, all of these things. And it seems that it's not just a passive thing that's happening. This is active. And how can we get to where you want to be when there's this active, I want to use the word, war on democracy in so many ways to really do it. And I'll throw in Rupert Murdoch with his with Fox News, which also tends to influence people's thoughts and ideas against what you might be saying.
Yeah, there is no easy answer to the worries you've raised about those developments, about the increase in the power of money and the kind of corporate mentality that's taken over institutions, and maybe to the detriment of democracy. But the only place we're going to start is, first of all, saying we know it's there, and people demanding. As I said, I don't think political leaders are the initial people we can go to. We've got to say to non-governmental organizations, religious organizations, foundations and think tanks where people claim to care. You know, right now there's a meeting of the UN General Assembly in New York. It's part of the reason I got here 5 minutes later than I thought I would. We need to say as citizens that we think it's got to change, and that deliberative citizen assemblies, there's a guy at, I think he's at UCLA, named James Fishkin, who has shown that you can get people in these, they want it, and they will talk to each other across the boundaries that make them not want to pay attention to these things that are going on. And then once they start paying attention, you can get them to be more mindful about pushing back. It would take me 30 minutes, I think, to answer every part of your worry, but I think the citizen assemblies, the forums I talked about in the first section, so sections 1 and 2 are giving us, I think, the kind of citizen mechanisms that you start with, we have to say we won't take it anymore. Interestingly, I didn't expect myself that labor would come back at this moment in the 21st century with such forcefulness as it has. And I'm thinking, you don't have, it's not about left and right. I genuinely believe this, that when you say, if you're a guy on the assembly line, and the CEO is making, what, 50, 60, 70 times, and they're not producing anything. They're counting on you to do it. That might be the start. I'm not against business. Certainly not. And I'm not, I had somebody come to my office yesterday in Columbia and say, you ought to be against capitalism. And I thought, well, there's Joseph Stiglitz says there is a kind of capitalism that could be, human friendly. I kind of have that belief. And I think labor might be right now the place where the humanness or the demand for humanness and decrease. I think economic inequality is in fact in the real issue, and everything else will follow.
I'm listening to a silly book in the car, but I heard something this morning that really stuck with me, and then you said something. And they were talking about religious organizations, Christianity, that is not very kind to others. And if you are saying that we should rely on religious organizations to help us over all of these conflicts,
Yeah.
I'm not so sure that that's the right place to go to. Because when I take a look at the three denominations that I'm involved with, one is very progressive, one is, much to my surprise, doing better, and the third is kicking and screaming and dividing.
Yeah.
So I don't see that religious organizations are the answer or even a part of an answer to this horrible situation that we're in.
I
Thank you.
completely understand. Let me say just two things. I'm not going to deny the weight of some of your worries. The thing that makes me pessimistic is that I have heard it said by some American religious groups, when they hear things like turn the other cheek, that's communism. They don't understand that that's coming from the Bible, from the New Testament. What does this mean? That the religious organizations that don't want politics and religion to be so intermingled, that don't want resentment and bitterness and anger to shape their religious actions in the world, they need to speak up. I mention Lederach because he is who he is. I believe Martin Luther King was who he was because they found a way to carve out, because religious organizations have always had both those who are progressive and those who are not. The letter from Birmingham jail, right, is King's way of saying there were all these Southern Christians who were saying to him, you're moving too fast, you need to stop, you're causing trouble. He said, my understanding of the faith is that our responsibility is to create this thing he called the beloved community, the understanding goodwill. I do think there are religious organizations. Now, of course, the Atlantic had the story just a few weeks ago about how there's a declining membership in all religious organizations in the U.S., and that's a global phenomenon. But, when I think of John Paul Lederach, who has risked his life, he even had his daughter's life in danger once when he and his wife had traveled to do some of the work he was doing, conflict. They threatened to kidnap the daughter, and his wife said, are you sure we gotta be doing this? It was resolved and she's fine, but I do think there still is room for religious organizations. I think there's a social mission and a great deal of Catholicism, here we are on a Catholic campus, that does open up possibilities for resisting. But when I heard this, I actually knew it was coming, but when they started listing all these things that I know are from the New Testament, I thought we are in trouble until somebody religious speaks And that's another place where only if ordinary religious people would want to reclaim their faith. It doesn't mean there's no disagreement within even a faith where people want to be socially active. Right? Dorothy Day, right, was anti-abortion, but she was pro helping people. So I'd take Dorothy Day any day over any other thing she did or didn't believe. The Catholic workers. Yeah, thank you. I'd take her over anybody, whatever else I might disagree with her. But it's only if people who have knowledge and have credibility and authority will then speak and say, don't misrepresent this as something. Is that of any? You are so right. And actually, somebody from the Southern Baptist Convention, maybe about a week ago, actually said he could not be part of it anymore if that's how they're going to talk. This is not a guy who's giving up his faith. He's just giving up his connection to this particular organization, that convention. They didn't decide slavery was wrong until 2002. So it was a little late.
Well, first of all, I love much of what you said, but I read Plato a little more pessimistically than you do, in the sense that what he says as one of the main fractures in democracy is that people disagree and they get tired of their disagreement, which leads them to desire the tyrant who will answer their questions for them, which I think applies today in unfortunate ways. But I also wonder if that is a profound problem with democracy that is anticipated. You began by pointing out Enlightenment was criticized right away. Well, when you look for universal principles, you set up the possibility of dilemmas, of conflict between universal principles. And we have that. You mentioned one yourself, between equality and merit. If Plato's right, we just get tired of arguing about dilemmas, and I'm adding something that's also right, that dilemmas are irresolvable, that really paints a very pessimistic picture that your political and social issues address, but it doesn't address the fundamental problem of our disagreement over value.
Which is why I start with John Rawls, who spent, so he's the guy who's famous for this book in 1971, A Theory of Justice, that revived basically political philosophy in the 20th century. And that's one reason I went to study with him. And then he comes along later and he says the problem is disagreement. But disagreement can be something we can learn to live with. I'm not sure, I don't accept Rawls's view. It would take another 20, 30 minutes to explain more of it. But here's the thing I will say about Plato. One of the things that Plato is moved, I believe, by anger and resentment and bitterness over the killing of Socrates. But you know who didn't have that bitterness and resentment? So I have a version of some things that in a slightly related paper. Socrates is the figure we ought to look to for the model. So Socrates says, never get tired. Let's keep having the conversation. I think what happened was, so Hannah Arendt has a story, I think it's the essay of Truth and Politics, where she says that's where Plato's disdain for democracy comes from, that it's this sense that they didn't see this wonderful creature they had in their midst and they killed him. And that's true, they did put him to death. But Socrates himself, a lot like John Lewis and M.L. King and these other people, they had a kind of optimism that transcended the worst of human beings, to believe that if you got to the best of them, you might have hope for saving these institutions. And I guess I confess, I think sometimes I'm reading Plato, because I'm about to teach this I'm teaching apology actually on next Monday that has Socrates as the central figure. For me, the best of Plato is that he gave us the image of Socrates, who never let up and never gave in and never let pessimism, even about the many, discourage him from thinking that we ought to keep the conversations going. That's for me, that's also Paul Lederach, John Paul. I think his comes out of a religious view that, although oddly, you know, Socrates talks about having this divine guide that's always telling him what to do and not do, keeps him from being too bound up with ordinary life, and he says, kill me, you can't kill the value of the things I'm doing. That's my Plato, is the one who gave me Socrates. He gave me one of the great figures. Gandhi translates the Apology into Gujarati while he's in prison. King, of course, in a letter from Birmingham jail. It's the Socratic. And Dewey talks about conflict as this thing that is the conflict and disagreement. I should have brought Dewey back. He actually says, I think this is in Human Nature and Conduct, but I would have to go back and refresh my memory. He says it's without conflict, there's no growth. So don't give up on the disagreement, even as some of our great thinkers have. And maybe Plato, I think you're right. I didn't mention that dimension of it, but I think I'm reading Plato through Richard Rorty in the book Achieving Our Country, which focuses more on the equality.
Last question.
I believe in, that's okay, I'll talk on it.
Well, for the stream, we can't.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If you can speak into the microphone.
I believe in individual rights, which you briefly mentioned once or twice. And I also believe that government should be restricted to protecting people's life, liberty, and property. So my question is, in a democratic society, would you allow something to be on the ballot? For example, homosexuals can't get married. There's no interracial marriage. Military service is compulsory. Would you allow that to be on the ballot, those 3 items to be on the ballot?
Could I take a rain check? No, for the following reason. On all of them, well, I would say I personally would not want it on the ballot, but I can tell you why at least one of them, compulsory military service. If there were other kinds of service that you could opt into instead of fighting in the military, compulsory service to your country. Compulsory military service, and that's one reason I went to time to reframe it. Now, I'm going to say things that will probably upset people. I personally believe if people actually want to not be libertines and get married, I personally think, you may not like this, you not allow it. I am in an interracial marriage, so going on year 40, so I kind of like that too. But on the military part, I rather think that the phrasing I would be not uncomfortable with would be phrasing that said service to your country. Some of it potentially military, and some you're in a citizen corps where you go and you help cities rebuild after a hurricane or something like that. But compulsory work, everybody had to do a few years of it. I wouldn't be bothered by it.
Thank you for taking a rain check.
Oh, okay. I actually
I'm
didn't
against
take it.
compulsory stuff. Thank you
I
again.
actually didn't take it. The one place where I'm not is on the idea of being willing to sacrifice. And I just said, I did not myself fully appreciate, even though my mother still has some of the ration things. Say from, I guess everybody got, even little kids were given a ration card. I did not know how demanding the sacrifice of American citizens was during the war. It was everybody, people, food rations, how much could you have of this canned good and that canned good, and I did not appreciate that. But I wouldn't be standing here but for the sacrifices that those people made, including some of my family members who fought in the war, while others, while some of the women in my family worked in steel mills, and had to wear shoes where they wouldn't get burned from the timber. And sacrifice is not a bad thing if it's for a good that is shared and promotes goals. Maybe the 2 goals I just mentioned earlier are not ones everybody shares. I respect that disagreement, but Thank you.